Snow smothers the world outside, swallowing every sound beneath an endless sheet of white. Inside Glennsville Sanatorium, the silence lasts only a heartbeat before it is ripped apart by screams so desperate they seem to echo through the walls themselves. Fluorescent lights flicker over polished corridors as terrified doctors race between locked wards, believing reinforced doors and clinical routines can still contain the nightmare they created. Then those doors fail. Flesh tears. Steel bites. Blood splashes across spotless tile with shocking violence, transforming a place built for healing into a maze of mutilation. The Hilliker brothers are no longer patients. They are predators, and every corridor becomes another hunting ground where survival is measured in seconds rather than minutes. Even decades later, that opening remains startling because it refuses restraint. There is no slow introduction, no comforting sense that the audience will be eased into the terror. Instead, Wrong Turn 4, Bloody Beginnings throws viewers into absolute chaos from its very first moments, announcing that mercy has no place within these frozen walls. Every brutal encounter feels designed to erase the illusion of safety before the title has even settled into memory. The film understands that horror often begins with atmosphere, but it chooses something even more unsettling. It begins with inevitability. That confidence is part of what transformed this sequel into something unexpectedly enduring among dedicated horror fans. Released during the early 2010s, when theatrical horror increasingly leaned toward polished visuals, supernatural mysteries, and carefully timed jump scares, this direct-to-video prequel embraced the opposite philosophy. It was unapologetically grimy, aggressively excessive, and almost confrontational in its commitment to practical gore. For many viewers, discovering it felt like uncovering forbidden media that somehow escaped the industry's growing obsession with broader audience appeal. It never carried the prestige of a theatrical blockbuster, yet it circulated through DVD shelves, late-night marathons, and whispered recommendations between genre enthusiasts who promised, "You won't believe how far this movie goes." That reputation raises an intriguing question. Why did one modestly budgeted prequel, released with little mainstream attention, become the installment so many gorehounds still remember first? Countless horror sequels have chased bigger kills and louder spectacle, yet few inspire the same strange affection. The answer reaches beyond exploding blood packs or graphic makeup effects. It lives in the film's willingness to embrace uncomfortable brutality without apology, creating an experience that feels inseparably tied to a specific era of horror fandom. For many longtime viewers, watching Wrong Turn 4 today also means revisiting a moment before streaming algorithms flattened every recommendation into predictable categories. It recalls an age when unrated horror still felt rebellious, when finding an especially vicious film carried the excitement of discovering something you were never quite supposed to see. That feeling lingers beneath every crimson-stained hallway of Glennsville Sanatorium, waiting beneath the snow like something that was never truly buried. The massacre inside Glennsville Sanatorium is only the beginning of a much larger story. Those blood-soaked hallways are more than an unforgettable opening set piece. They establish a chain of consequences that stretches across decades, eventually colliding with a group of carefree snowmobilers who have no idea they are riding toward a place history has already condemned. Between those two moments lies the real reason Wrong Turn 4 continues to fascinate horror fans long after its release. Beneath the outrageous violence is a surprisingly deliberate structure that rewards a closer look. That is exactly what this deep dive sets out to explore. Rather than rushing from one kill to the next, we'll carefully unpack every layer that gives the film its lasting identity. Across 12 connected chapters, we'll examine the origins of the prequel, the production choices that shaped its brutal style, the hidden mechanics of its narrative, the psychology behind its central characters, the visual language of the abandoned asylum, the infamous practical effects, and the themes that quietly emerge beneath all the bloodshed. We'll also revisit the most memorable death sequences, the pacing that divides audiences, and the creative decisions that continue to spark debate among longtime fans. By the end, the goal is not simply to remember the movie but to understand why it still occupies such a distinctive place within modern horror. The most interesting discovery may not be found in the violence at all. Wrong Turn 4 has often been criticized because its characters make reckless, frustrating decisions that seem impossible to defend. Yet what if those choices are not accidental weaknesses? What if their repeated mistakes form the very architecture of the horror itself? Viewed through that perspective, the film transforms into a story driven by tragic irony, where every poor decision pushes ordinary people deeper into a nightmare that the audience already knows cannot end well. The tension comes less from wondering whether disaster will arrive and more from watching every opportunity to escape slowly disappear. Looking back at early 2010 slasher prequels also reveals something about horror's evolution. This was a period caught between the gritty excess of the previous decade and the more restrained, psychologically focused wave that followed. Films like Wrong Turn 4 occupied an unusual space, free from theatrical expectations yet bold enough to indulge the unapologetic brutality that many studios were beginning to avoid. That freedom gave them an identity modern horror rarely attempts to recreate. Time has a way of changing reputations. Movies once dismissed as disposable often reveal unexpected strengths when viewed outside the expectations of their release. As the snow continues to fall over Glensville, the path leading from one frozen tragedy to another begins to look far more carefully designed than it first appears. For many horror fans, Wrong Turn 4 is more than another sequel tucked into a long-running franchise. It belongs to a very specific era that feels increasingly distant, when discovering a movie was an experience all its own. Before endless streaming libraries placed thousands of titles a single click away, horror often lived on crowded DVD shelves lined with oversized cover art that seemed determined to outdo one another. Frost-covered forests, blood-red lettering, twisted faces, and promises of an unrated experience practically demanded attention. Even before the plastic case was opened, the imagination had already begun filling in the horrors waiting inside. There was something strangely exciting about spotting a film like this during a late-night trip to the rental store or wandering through the discount aisle of a supermarket. Maybe you had never heard anyone recommend it. Maybe the critics had ignored it completely. None of that mattered. The artwork alone suggested you had stumbled across something forbidden, something louder, meaner, and less interested in playing by mainstream rules. Bringing it home felt like making a small gamble, hoping the movie hidden behind that cover would deliver on every outrageous promise printed across the back. For countless viewers, those nights became unforgettable rituals. Lights dimmed. Friends gathered around the television with far too much junk food. Someone inevitably claimed they had seen a scene so disturbing that nobody else would make it through without looking away. Half the fun came from anticipating the next outrageous kill, guessing who would survive, and laughing in disbelief whenever the film somehow found an even more excessive way to shock its audience. These movies rarely pretended to be sophisticated prestige cinema, and that honesty became part of their charm. If you still have a soft spot for chaotic slashers packed with impossible survival choices, relentless body counts, and gleefully over-the-top gore, there is no reason to apologize for it. Horror has always been a broad genre with room for elegant psychological nightmares and unapologetic splatter spectacles alike. Wrong Turn 4 embraces the latter identity without hesitation. It knows exactly what kind of ride it wants to deliver, and that confidence is one reason so many fans continue returning to it despite its flaws. Yet stopping there means overlooking something surprisingly fascinating. Beneath the graphic violence and outrageous set pieces is a level of construction that often disappears behind the film's reputation. The abandoned asylum, the relentless snowstorm, the pacing of the tension, and even many of the characters' seemingly irrational decisions begin to reveal a more deliberate design when viewed with fresh eyes. What first appears to be simple excess gradually exposes patterns that reward closer attention. That hidden layer is what makes revisiting movies like Wrong Turn 4 worthwhile today. Beyond the blood and chaos lies a film that says far more about its era, its audience, and the evolution of slasher storytelling than its reputation has ever been given credit for. Every long-running horror franchise eventually reaches a crossroads where simply repeating the same formula is no longer enough. After several entries built around isolated forests, unsuspecting travelers, and the relentless brutality of the cannibalistic Hilliker family, the Wrong Turn series found itself facing exactly that challenge. Audiences still expected shocking deaths and grisly practical effects, but familiarity threatened to dull the impact. The filmmakers needed a fresh angle that could preserve the franchise's identity while giving longtime fans a reason to return. That search for reinvention became the foundation of Wrong Turn 4, Bloody Beginnings. Following the release of Wrong Turn 3, the responsibility for steering the next chapter fell to writer and director Declan O'Brien. Rather than treating another sequel as an opportunity to repeat familiar beats with a new group of victims, O'Brien looked backward instead of forward. His central idea was surprisingly straightforward yet full of dramatic potential. Instead of asking what the Hilliker brothers would do next, he asked where everything truly began. An origin story offered something the franchise had only hinted at before, allowing the monsters to exist within a recognizable human environment before becoming the legends that later films would fear. By shifting the timeline decades into the past, the story could explore the collapse of order rather than simply its aftermath. That concept naturally demanded a setting unlike anything audiences had already seen. Earlier Wrong Turn films drew much of their identity from dense Appalachian forests, winding back roads, and endless stretches of green wilderness where danger could emerge from behind any tree. Those landscapes became visual shorthand for the franchise itself. Repeating them once again, however, risked making the new installment feel interchangeable with its predecessors. The solution was to replace familiar woods with an environment that felt equally isolated but emotionally colder in every sense of the word. Snow transformed the series almost immediately. Endless white landscapes created a different kind of imprisonment. Forests conceal threats within shadows, while frozen terrain exposes everything, leaving victims with nowhere meaningful to hide. The silence of falling snow carries a haunting stillness that contrasts sharply with the explosions of violence the franchise is known for. Every footprint becomes evidence. Every gust of wind emphasizes isolation. Survival no longer depends only on escaping the killers but also on enduring an environment capable of claiming lives all by itself. That visual shift gave Wrong Turn 4 a distinctive personality before a single death scene unfolded. To bring that atmosphere to life, production moved to Manitoba, Canada, with much of the filming taking place around Winnipeg during genuine winter conditions. Rather than relying entirely on artificial snow or controlled studio environments, the filmmakers embraced the harsh climate as an active storytelling tool. The freezing temperatures visible on screen are not merely convincing performances. The environment itself constantly influences the look and feel of the film, adding authenticity to every breath hanging in the air and every desperate struggle through the snow-covered landscape. One of the production's most memorable decisions was securing access to the former Brandon Mental Health Center for the abandoned sanatorium sequences. The aging institution provided long corridors, weathered walls, and an atmosphere that would have been extraordinarily difficult to recreate convincingly on sound stages with the available resources. Its worn architecture contributes a quiet realism that grounds even the film's most outrageous moments. Instead of feeling like a haunted house attraction designed for a horror movie, the building carries the unsettling weight of a place that genuinely existed, allowing audiences to imagine years of forgotten history lingering beneath cracked paint and empty rooms. Working inside such a location, however, did not remove the realities of low-budget filmmaking. Like many direct-to-video productions of its era, Wrong Turn 4 operated within significant financial limitations. Every shooting day demanded careful planning, and every major sequence required balancing ambition against available resources. Elaborate action scenes, large amounts of makeup effects, and challenging winter conditions all competed for the same limited production budget. Efficiency became just as important as creativity. The weather introduced another layer of difficulty. Freezing temperatures complicated equipment, slowed production schedules, and tested cast and crew alike. Outdoor scenes required endurance as much as performance, while maintaining continuity between takes became increasingly demanding. Yet those very obstacles also contributed to the finished film's visual identity. The relentless cold visible throughout the story rarely feels manufactured because, in many respects, it wasn't. At the same time, the creative team had to satisfy clear expectations from the studio. Wrong Turn had built its reputation on graphic violence, and audiences picking up the latest installment expected shocking kills almost immediately. Delaying the carnage for extended character development risked disappointing the franchise's core fanbase. The opening massacre inside Glensville Sanatorium reflects that understanding, delivering brutal spectacle within minutes while simultaneously establishing the historical foundation for everything that follows. Balancing those competing priorities became the defining creative challenge of the production. The film needed to function as an accessible standalone prequel for newcomers while rewarding longtime fans with deeper insight into the franchise's mythology. It had to honor the series' reputation for outrageous gore without allowing violence alone to carry the experience. Out of those limitations emerged a surprisingly distinctive chapter, one shaped as much by frozen landscapes, practical necessity, and creative adaptation as by the blood that ultimately made it unforgettable. To understand why Wrong Turn 4 found such a loyal audience, it helps to remember the horror landscape it entered. By 2011, the genre was in the middle of another major transformation. The previous decade had been defined by relentless intensity. Films competed to shock audiences with increasingly graphic violence, morally bleak stories, and elaborate death sequences that became cultural talking points almost overnight. At the same time, a different movement was reshaping mainstream horror from the opposite direction. Found footage films had exploded into popular culture, proving that simplicity and atmosphere could be just as commercially powerful as extravagant spectacle. Horror was no longer moving along a single path. It was splitting into multiple identities, each chasing a different audience. The enormous success of the Paranormal Activity series demonstrated that suspense, minimalism, and suggestion could generate extraordinary box office returns. Instead of constant visual carnage, these films relied on anticipation, silence, and the fear of what might happen just outside the frame. Audiences embraced the illusion of realism, and studios quickly recognized the financial appeal of productions that required relatively modest budgets while reaching massive theatrical audiences. As more projects followed that formula, the genre's center of gravity shifted towards supernatural tension rather than relentless physical brutality. Meanwhile, the era that critics often associated with the influence of the Saw franchise was beginning to evolve. Throughout the 2000s, increasingly elaborate traps, graphic injuries, and emotionally punishing scenarios had become defining characteristics of many horror releases. By the start of the new decade, however, audience tastes were changing. Viewers had already experienced years of escalating extremity, making simple attempts to become bloodier than the last film less effective than they once were. Studios gradually explored different directions, searching for broader appeal instead of endlessly raising the stakes of graphic violence. Traditional slashers faced their own challenge during this period. While the formula remained recognizable and beloved among genre enthusiasts, theatrical releases struggled to dominate popular conversation the way they had in earlier decades. Familiar franchises still existed, but many found themselves competing against supernatural horror, psychological thrillers, and found footage sensations that captured greater mainstream attention. For classic body count movies built around isolated groups of victims and relentless killers, the theatrical spotlight had become increasingly difficult to reclaim. Yet what appeared to be a decline in one part of the market became an opportunity in another. The direct-to-video landscape flourished throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, creating a reliable home for franchise continuations that might never receive wide theatrical releases. DVD and Blu-ray sales remained significant, rental stores still attracted dedicated horror fans, and home entertainment offered filmmakers greater freedom to target niche audiences without the enormous financial pressures attached to theatrical distribution. Success no longer depended solely on opening weekend ticket sales. A passionate fan base could sustain an entire franchise through home viewing alone. Within that environment, Wrong Turn occupied a particularly comfortable position. The series had already established clear expectations. Fans wanted isolated locations, inventive kills, grotesque villains, and practical effects that pushed every confrontation beyond ordinary slasher violence. The franchise understood exactly what its audience expected, and the marketing embraced that identity without hesitation. Rather than attempting to present Wrong Turn 4 as elevated horror or psychological prestige, promotional material highlighted the qualities longtime fans already celebrated. One word became especially important: unrated. During this era, that label carried remarkable weight among horror enthusiasts. It suggested fewer compromises, harsher violence, and a viewing experience untouched by theatrical content restrictions. Whether every unrated release truly delivered dramatically different material mattered less than the promise itself. The word implied authenticity, as though viewers were gaining access to the version the filmmakers genuinely wanted them to see. For fans who believed theatrical horror had become increasingly restrained, that promise felt irresistible. The advertising reflected this strategy by emphasizing icy isolation, grotesque makeup, and uncompromising brutality instead of complex mysteries or emotional drama. Every trailer and promotional image reinforced the message that Wrong Turn 4 intended to satisfy audiences searching for raw, unapologetic horror. The snowy setting distinguished it visually from earlier installments, but the marketing never allowed anyone to mistake the franchise's priorities. This was still a movie built around survival, violence, and the terrifying unpredictability of the Hilliker brothers. Of course, that approach also created a difficult balancing act. Dedicated fans entered the film with enormous expectations shaped by the previous entries. They anticipated inventive kills, memorable villains, and escalating brutality, yet they also understood the realities of direct-to-video production. Limited budgets inevitably meant fewer resources than major theatrical releases, making comparisons to studio blockbusters somewhat unfair. Viewers often approached these sequels with two competing mindsets at once. They hoped for something unexpectedly great while preparing themselves for the compromises that usually accompanied lower-budget franchise installments. That tension became part of the experience surrounding Wrong Turn 4 itself. Some audiences judged it primarily through the lens of production value, while others focused on whether it delivered the unapologetic entertainment they had come to expect. Interestingly, the film rarely tried to disguise its limitations. Instead, it leaned into atmosphere, practical gore, and an aggressively committed tone, using confidence rather than scale to leave an impression. Looking back today, the movie occupies a fascinating position within horror history. It arrived during a period when mainstream trends were drifting toward different kinds of fear, yet it stubbornly preserved the unapologetic spirit of an earlier era. Instead of chasing every new fashion, Wrong Turn 4 doubled down on the qualities that made devoted slasher fans fall in love with unrated horror in the first place, ensuring that its reputation would ultimately be built less on commercial success than on the lasting loyalty of the audience it understood from the very beginning. Wrong Turn 4 wastes almost no time explaining the rules of its world. Before audiences meet the modern cast or even understand where the story is heading, the film rewinds to 1974 and locks the camera inside Glensville Sanatorium, a place that already feels more like a prison than a hospital. The corridors are clean, the staff appear confident, and routine seems firmly under control. Yet beneath that orderly surface lies an uncomfortable truth. This institution is not merely housing dangerous patients. It is attempting to contain something fundamentally beyond its understanding. At the center of that nightmare are three brothers whose appearances alone instantly communicate that they exist outside ordinary human experience. One Eye, Sawtooth, and Three Finger are introduced not as mysterious monsters lurking in the wilderness but as confined inmates whose violent reputations have already become part of the asylum's daily reality. Even before they escape, the atmosphere suggests the building is holding back a disaster that has only been delayed rather than prevented. The film cleverly avoids spending excessive time explaining every detail of their past. Instead, it relies on visual storytelling. Their physical deformities, unsettling behavior, and complete lack of empathy immediately establish them as predators rather than misunderstood victims. There is something disturbingly animalistic about the way they observe their surroundings, as though every hallway is already being measured as future hunting territory. By withholding elaborate backstories, the movie allows the audience's imagination to fill the gaps, making the brothers feel even more unpredictable. Then everything collapses. The breakout unfolds with astonishing speed, reflecting the terrifying reality that carefully constructed systems often fail in moments rather than hours. Locked doors become meaningless. Hospital equipment turns into improvised weapons. Doctors and security staff, who moments earlier represented authority and control, suddenly become frightened prey. The violence is immediate, graphic, and chaotic, emphasizing panic over choreography. Nobody has time to formulate heroic plans because survival itself becomes increasingly unlikely with every passing minute. Each brother contributes a different layer to the unfolding horror. Three Finger displays the calculated confidence that longtime fans already associate with the franchise, moving through victims with frightening efficiency. One Eye's relentless aggression creates an atmosphere of constant danger, while Sawtooth's unpredictable brutality reinforces the sense that conventional logic has completely broken down. Together, they function less like independent killers and more like a terrifying force of nature, overwhelming the institution through sheer savagery. The setting amplifies every moment. Glensville Sanatorium is not simply a backdrop for violence. Its endless corridors, reinforced doors, treatment rooms, and narrow passageways transform the massacre into an oppressive maze where escape becomes almost impossible. The architecture itself contributes to the suspense, trapping both victims and viewers inside a place that was designed to isolate danger but ultimately becomes the very reason no one can easily flee from it. The surrounding snowstorm quietly strengthens this introduction as well. Outside, the frozen landscape cuts the building off from meaningful help. The world beyond the windows feels unreachable, making every scream echo against an overwhelming sense of abandonment. Even before the narrative jumps forward, the audience understands that Glensville has become a place swallowed by history, its tragedy buried beneath years of drifting snow and forgotten memories. The film then leaps forward to 2003, replacing institutional terror with youthful freedom. Bright conversations, playful teasing, and the excitement of a winter adventure immediately contrast the grim hopelessness of the opening sequence. The transition is deliberately disarming. Instead of remaining inside horror, the story briefly adopts the energy of a vacation movie, encouraging viewers to relax even though they already know exactly where the road is leading. At the center of the new group is Kenya, whose confident personality naturally positions her as one of the social anchors of the friends. She projects independence while still participating in the group's playful chemistry, making her feel approachable rather than exaggerated. Jenna brings a different energy, balancing confidence with moments of emotional openness that hint at deeper relationships beneath the surface conversations. Bridget often acts as a stabilizing presence, observing the group's interactions without constantly demanding attention, while Sarah contributes warmth and familiarity that reinforces the feeling these characters genuinely know one another beyond the events of the film. The remaining members complete a recognizable collection of personalities common to ensemble slashers, but they avoid feeling entirely interchangeable during these opening scenes. Friendships overlap naturally. Conversations interrupt one another. Small jokes and casual disagreements create the impression that this group has shared experiences long before the audience arrived. That sense of familiarity is important because horror depends not only on danger but also on believing something valuable exists before it is threatened. Romantic tensions quietly weave through these interactions without overwhelming the pacing. Attraction, jealousy, playful flirting, and lingering emotional uncertainty emerge in subtle exchanges rather than dramatic declarations. These relationships help define individual motivations while planting the emotional fractures that will later influence crucial decisions. The audience begins recognizing alliances almost instinctively, understanding who naturally trusts whom and where underlying insecurities already exist beneath the laughter. What makes these early moments particularly effective is their normality. The characters are not investigating haunted ruins or deliberately searching for danger. They are simply enjoying a snowmobiling trip, embracing the thrill of speed across an endless white landscape. Their confidence feels earned because, from their perspective, the wilderness represents excitement rather than menace. They believe they are in control of their adventure. The environment quietly disagrees. As the group pushes farther into unfamiliar territory, subtle warning signs begin accumulating. Visibility becomes increasingly unreliable. Landmarks disappear beneath thick snowfall. Conversations gradually shift from carefree excitement toward practical concerns about direction and weather. The immense landscape that initially appeared beautiful now starts revealing its indifference. Snow is no longer simply scenery. It becomes an obstacle capable of erasing every sense of orientation. Then the blizzard arrives with overwhelming force. What had been a recreational outing instantly transforms into a desperate struggle against nature itself. Wind howls across the open terrain, swallowing voices and reducing visibility to only a few feet. Every attempt to navigate becomes another opportunity to drift farther from safety. Panic spreads gradually rather than explosively, reflecting the terrifying realization that the greatest threat may no longer be getting lost for a few minutes but disappearing entirely into a frozen wilderness where help cannot possibly find them. In that single moment, the film completes its setup with remarkable efficiency. The audience already knows the abandoned sanatorium still waits somewhere beneath the storm, while the characters remain blissfully unaware that every wrong turn through the snow is guiding them toward a place where history never truly ended. The blizzard changes the story long before the killers ever appear. Until this point, the frozen wilderness has been little more than the backdrop for an adventurous weekend. A vast playground where snowmobiles carve effortless paths across untouched fields of white. Once the weather turns, however, that same landscape becomes frighteningly indifferent. The horizon disappears behind walls of blowing snow, familiar trails vanish beneath fresh drifts, and every direction begins to look exactly like the last. The freedom that defined the group's journey quietly transforms into entrapment. One of the film's smartest visual decisions is allowing nature to become the first antagonist. There is no immediate attack waiting behind a tree and no sudden glimpse of the Hilliker brothers stalking their victims. Instead, the audience watches something much more believable unfold. The characters slowly lose confidence in their own surroundings. Every minute spent battling the storm drains their energy while increasing the pressure to find shelter before the cold becomes just as deadly as anything hiding within the forest. This gradual shift in tone is remarkably effective because it mirrors real human psychology. Faced with freezing temperatures, limited visibility, and the growing possibility of becoming stranded overnight, people naturally begin prioritizing immediate survival over abstract caution. The danger they can feel, the biting wind and relentless cold, overshadows dangers they cannot yet imagine. That instinct ultimately guides every decision the group makes from this point forward. When the abandoned Glensville sanatorium finally emerges through the swirling snow, it feels almost miraculous. Its dark silhouette rises from the storm like an impossible landmark, offering the first convincing promise of warmth and protection since the weather collapsed around them. To the audience, the building represents inevitable horror because its history has already been revealed. To the characters, it looks like salvation. That dramatic irony becomes one of the sequence's greatest strengths. Viewers already understand that these walls witnessed unimaginable violence decades earlier. The group does not. They see only a structure capable of shielding them from freezing to death. Horror frequently thrives on information gaps, and Wrong Turn 4 exploits that imbalance with surprising confidence. Every step the characters take toward the asylum feels logical from their perspective while simultaneously becoming more unsettling for everyone watching. Approaching the building also marks an important transition in the film's visual language. The vast openness of the snow-covered wilderness gives way to heavy architecture, broken windows, rusted metal, and long shadows stretching across forgotten corridors. Instead of fearing what might be hidden among endless trees, the audience begins fearing what might be waiting behind the next closed door. The story exchanges horizontal space for vertical confinement, replacing natural isolation with oppressive interior claustrophobia. Crossing the threshold into Glensville is more than simply entering another location. It functions almost like stepping into another era. Time appears frozen inside the abandoned institution. Dust covers forgotten furniture. Decaying walls carry silent reminders of lives interrupted decades earlier. Medical equipment, damaged fixtures, and neglected hallways create the impression that the building was never truly emptied, only abandoned in the middle of its own tragedy. Every room whispers fragments of a history the characters never pause to fully consider. Breaking inside feels justified under the circumstances. Faced with worsening weather, the group has little reason to remain outside debating property laws or questioning whether an abandoned institution is technically safe to enter. Their decision reflects practical survival rather than reckless curiosity. This distinction matters because the film consistently builds its horror from understandable choices. They are not inviting danger for entertainment. They are responding to circumstances that leave increasingly few alternatives. Once sheltered from the storm, relief spreads quickly through the group. Cold hands begin warming. Heavy winter gear comes off. Nervous conversations gradually return to laughter as everyone realizes they have escaped the immediate threat outside. The emotional atmosphere softens almost instantly, illustrating how dramatically human behavior changes once basic survival appears secure. Their priorities shift from enduring the blizzard to making the unexpected overnight stop as comfortable as possible. That renewed confidence naturally leads to celebration. Music, drinking, jokes, and playful conversations reclaim the energy that the storm temporarily stole away. In another film, these moments might simply exist to establish disposable victims before the violence begins. Here, they serve a more subtle purpose. They demonstrate how rapidly people normalize unfamiliar environments once immediate danger seems to have passed. The asylum stops feeling like an abandoned institution and starts resembling an unusually strange vacation cabin. Meanwhile, the building itself quietly tells a completely different story. The camera repeatedly lingers on unsettling details that the characters either overlook or dismiss without serious thought. Rust stains creep along forgotten walls. Old medical rooms remain eerily intact despite decades of abandonment. Wheelchairs, restraints, and deteriorating equipment hint at lives once confined within these corridors. The production design rarely shouts its warnings. Instead, it encourages the audience to absorb countless visual clues that collectively create an overwhelming sense of unease. Even seemingly ordinary discoveries carry unsettling implications. Faded records, damaged furnishings, and remnants of institutional life suggest that Glensville did not simply close because it became outdated. Something catastrophic interrupted its existence. The audience already knows exactly what happened, making every overlooked detail feel painfully significant. The characters, however, interpret these remnants as little more than eerie decoration inside an abandoned building. This disconnect fuels the growing suspense. Every ignored warning deepens the audience's anticipation without requiring immediate violence. Strange noises are rationalized as shifting structures settling beneath winter weather. Dark corridors remain unexplored because there is no pressing reason to investigate them. Locked areas become curiosities rather than urgent mysteries. Each choice feels believable precisely because nothing obvious has happened yet to justify genuine panic. The group also falls victim to another familiar psychological trap. Relief breeds complacency. Escaping the storm creates such a powerful emotional release that critical thinking begins to fade. The building's unsettling atmosphere loses its urgency once warmth, food, alcohol, and companionship restore a sense of normal life. Fear is replaced by routine, and routine is exactly what horror stories exploit most effectively. By allowing comfort to settle over the characters before introducing the true threat, Wrong Turn 4 carefully constructs a false sense of security. The blizzard has delivered them to a place where history still lingers beneath every cracked wall and silent hallway, yet the greatest danger is not what they fail to see. It is the confidence that convinces them there is nothing left to fear at all. The atmosphere inside Glensville changes almost imperceptibly at first. Laughter fades into uneasy silence, casual conversations become interrupted by distant sounds, and the abandoned building begins revealing that it is not nearly as empty as the stranded group believed. Until now, the asylum has functioned as an unsettling shelter, its cracked walls and forgotten rooms serving mainly as reminders of a terrible past. That illusion collapses the moment the unseen inhabitants decide the guests have stayed long enough. One of the film's most effective choices is refusing to rush this transition. Instead of unleashing immediate chaos, it allows tension to accumulate through uncertainty. Characters separate for ordinary reasons, exploring different sections of the building or searching for supplies, while the audience already understands that every isolated hallway creates another opportunity for disaster. The asylum itself becomes an accomplice, swallowing sound and obscuring sight lines so completely that danger can exist only a few steps away without revealing itself. The first major attack announces that the rules have changed permanently. Vincent's encounter is shocking not simply because of its graphic violence but because it demonstrates the cruel ingenuity behind the brothers' methods. Rather than relying solely on brute force, the killers manipulate the environment itself into a weapon. The infamous strip of flesh trap is staged with deliberate cruelty, forcing the audience to watch physical suffering unfold in agonizing detail instead of delivering a quick, merciful death. The sequence reflects the franchise's commitment to practical gore, emphasizing texture, resistance, and horrifying realism over rapid editing. Every movement becomes painful to witness, making the violence feel disturbingly tangible. More importantly, Vincent's fate destroys any remaining belief that the threat can be easily understood. Until this point, viewers might expect traditional slasher mechanics in which victims simply stumble into an attacker hiding around the next corner. Instead, the film establishes that the Hilliker brothers control the asylum like experienced predators defending familiar territory. Every hallway, every doorway, and every forgotten room can become part of a carefully orchestrated hunt. The horror intensifies again with Claire's death, one of the film's most memorable demonstrations of relentless brutality. The barbed wire sequence transforms an ordinary object into an instrument of unbearable suffering. Rather than presenting violence as stylized spectacle, the scene lingers on the physical impossibility of escape once the trap closes around its victim. It is not merely the bloodshed that unsettles audiences but the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Claire is caught in a situation where every instinct to survive only increases the pain, reinforcing the film's fascination with suffering that feels both grotesque and tragically inevitable. These early deaths accomplish more than providing memorable gore. They fundamentally reshape the emotional landscape of the story. The surviving characters can no longer convince themselves that isolated accidents or misunderstandings explain what is happening. The evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Something intelligent, violent, and deeply familiar with the building is actively hunting them. That realization introduces one of the film's strongest sources of tension. The group discovers they are not simply trapped inside an abandoned asylum. They are trapped inside with killers who have spent years turning its decaying architecture into an extension of themselves. Every route to safety has already been studied by those pursuing them. The survivors possess numbers, but the brothers possess complete knowledge of the terrain, transforming every attempt at escape into a desperate gamble. The asylum itself becomes increasingly oppressive as this understanding spreads. Corridors that previously appeared neglected now resemble carefully controlled pathways. Stairwells feel like bottlenecks waiting for ambushes. Heavy doors isolate survivors from one another, while endless intersections force impossible decisions about which direction offers genuine hope and which leads directly into another trap. The building ceases to be a location and evolves into a living maze whose design consistently favors its monstrous inhabitants. As fear replaces confidence, the group's internal dynamics begin to fracture. Horror frequently exposes personalities that remain hidden during ordinary circumstances, and Wrong Turn 4 follows that tradition with surprising consistency. Some characters instinctively surrender to panic, reacting emotionally to every new tragedy and allowing fear to dictate increasingly desperate choices. Others struggle to maintain composure, recognizing that emotional collapse may be just as dangerous as the killers themselves. Kenya gradually emerges as one of the few individuals attempting to preserve order amid the chaos. Her leadership does not stem from absolute certainty or extraordinary courage but from necessity. Someone must continue making decisions after every shocking discovery, and she repeatedly steps into that uncomfortable role even while sharing the same terror as everyone around her. This approach makes her feel more believable than the flawless heroes often found in conventional thrillers. She is frightened, uncertain, and overwhelmed, yet she keeps moving because stopping would almost certainly mean death. Not everyone responds with the same discipline. Grief, confusion, and disbelief spread rapidly through the remaining survivors. Arguments erupt over strategy, priorities, and responsibility, reflecting how quickly trust erodes when every mistake carries fatal consequences. Individuals begin questioning one another's judgment, while the killers require no such debates. Their purpose remains brutally simple, creating a stark contrast between organized predation and increasingly fragmented survival. The growing panic also exposes one of the film's central themes. Ordinary people rarely become perfect decision-makers under unimaginable pressure. From an outside perspective, certain choices may appear irrational or frustrating, yet the narrative repeatedly emphasizes exhaustion, shock, and emotional overload. The survivors are not operating with the detached clarity available to the audience. They are responding to relentless trauma while trying to process events that defy any reasonable expectation of reality. Eventually, the possibility of escaping the asylum altogether becomes the group's primary objective. Returning to their snowmobiles appears to offer the fastest route back to civilization, restoring hope that the nightmare might still have an exit. The idea is entirely logical. If the building has become a death trap, then distance itself seems like salvation. The brothers have already anticipated that possibility. When the survivors finally reach the snowmobiles, they discover their escape has been systematically eliminated. The machines that once symbolized freedom now lie destroyed, stripped of their ability to carry anyone away from the frozen wilderness. It is a devastating revelation because it removes the last comforting illusion that survival might depend only on courage or speed. The killers are not merely reacting to their victims. They are controlling the entire rhythm of the hunt. With the storm still raging beyond the walls and every practical means of escape reduced to twisted wreckage, Glensville Sanatorium completes its transformation into a prison. The survivors are no longer visitors seeking shelter from the cold. They have become prey inside a carefully sealed world where every corridor narrows toward another confrontation, and every passing moment shifts the balance further into the hands of those who have been waiting there all along. By the midpoint of Wrong Turn 4, survival is no longer about simply avoiding the killers. The remaining characters have accepted a terrifying truth that transforms every decision from this moment forward. The Hilliker brothers are not random threats wandering through the abandoned sanatorium. They understand the building completely, anticipate predictable human behavior, and possess an almost instinctive ability to exploit fear. Every failed escape attempt has reinforced the same lesson. Running alone will not save anyone. For the first time, the survivors realize they must confront the monsters directly if they hope to leave Glensville alive. That realization produces one of the film's most unexpected reversals. Through cooperation, timing, and a rare moment of tactical success, the group manages to outmaneuver the brothers. Using the asylum's own infrastructure against its inhabitants, they lure Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye into a reinforced holding cell before sealing the heavy door behind them. It is one of the few moments in the narrative where ordinary people appear to seize control of the situation rather than merely reacting to it. The emotional shift is immediate. For the first time since entering the sanatorium, panic gives way to cautious optimism. Breathing slows. Voices steady. The impossible suddenly seems possible. The killers who have dominated every encounter now stand behind iron bars, screaming with frustration instead of confidence. The visual reversal is striking because the film deliberately echoes the opening prologue. Decades earlier, the brothers escaped from confinement. Now history appears to have repeated itself in reverse, placing them back inside the very kind of prison they once destroyed. Yet the scene carries a subtle tension that extends beyond simple relief. The audience has already witnessed these men survive situations that should have ended their reign long ago. Their imprisonment feels satisfying, but never entirely convincing. The camera repeatedly reminds viewers that the danger has not disappeared. It has merely been delayed. That uncertainty quietly transforms what should be a triumphant victory into something much more fragile. The success also forces the survivors to confront a question they never expected to face. What do they do now? Kyle represents one side of the argument with uncompromising certainty. From his perspective, hesitation is no longer an option. The brothers have tortured, hunted, and murdered their friends without mercy. They have demonstrated repeatedly that they cannot be reasoned with, rehabilitated, or safely contained. Leaving them alive only guarantees additional bloodshed. His proposed solution is brutally simple. Lock the cell. Set it on fire. End the nightmare before it begins again. Within the logic of survival horror, Kyle's reasoning is difficult to dismiss. He is not driven purely by revenge, although grief certainly fuels his anger. His argument rests on practicality. Every previous attempt to outrun the killers has failed. Every opportunity they receive becomes another opportunity to kill. Destroying them now would eliminate the threat permanently. Standing opposite him is Kenya, whose response reveals one of the film's most defining moral conflicts. She refuses to cross that line. Her position is not based on naive optimism or the belief that the brothers deserve compassion. Instead, it reflects an unwillingness to become executioners, even under unimaginable circumstances. Killing helpless prisoners, regardless of their crimes, would fundamentally change the survivors themselves. In her eyes, surviving cannot come at the cost of abandoning every moral boundary that separates ordinary people from the monsters pursuing them. This disagreement elevates the sequence beyond a conventional argument over strategy. It becomes a collision between justice and survival, principle and necessity. Horror often forces characters into impossible ethical situations where every available choice carries devastating consequences. Wrong Turn 4 presents exactly that dilemma. There is no comforting option capable of preserving both morality and complete safety. From the audience's perspective, dramatic irony intensifies the entire exchange. Viewers familiar with slasher conventions instinctively recognize the danger of leaving seemingly defeated killers alive. Years of horror storytelling have conditioned audiences to expect one final reversal whenever villains remain capable of movement. The tension therefore shifts away from wondering what the characters will decide and toward anticipating the inevitable consequences of whichever decision they make. Kenya ultimately wins the debate. Rather than executing the brothers, the survivors settle for confinement. The cell remains locked, and attention turns toward escaping the asylum before the situation changes again. On paper, the decision appears reasonable. Reinforced bars have already contained the brothers once before. Surely they can do so again long enough for the group to reach safety. That assumption proves catastrophically misplaced. The film quietly emphasizes an important characteristic of the Hilliker brothers that has existed since the opening massacre. Their greatest strength is not overwhelming physical power alone. It is relentless adaptability. They constantly observe, improvise, and exploit weaknesses overlooked by everyone else. Given time, even the strongest prison becomes another puzzle waiting to be solved. Inside the cell, the brothers begin searching their surroundings with patient determination. They discover a simple object that most people would dismiss as meaningless. In their hands, however, it becomes a tool. Piece by piece, they manipulate the locking mechanism, demonstrating that confinement without finality is merely another temporary obstacle. The escape unfolds with chilling inevitability rather than explosive surprise. There is no miraculous coincidence and no unbelievable act of superhuman strength. Instead, the film reinforces its central idea that underestimating the brothers is consistently more dangerous than confronting them directly. The survivors mistake delay for victory, while the killers view imprisonment as nothing more than another stage of the hunt. Once free, the balance of power swings back with terrifying speed. Hope evaporates almost instantly. Safe rooms become death traps once again. Every decision that seemed intelligent only minutes earlier now reveals itself as another irreversible mistake. The psychological impact is almost greater than the physical danger. The survivors are forced to confront the crushing realization that their best opportunity has already slipped away, and they willingly allowed it to happen. The punishment for that hesitation arrives in one of the franchise's most infamous sequences. The so-called human fondue scene is remembered not simply because of its graphic imagery but because of the emotional cruelty surrounding it. The brothers capture victims under mistaken assumptions, believing they have seized the people responsible for their imprisonment. That misunderstanding creates a bitter layer of tragic irony. The suffering inflicted is not only horrifying in its execution but also driven by misplaced vengeance, demonstrating how violence inside this world spirals beyond logic into something almost ritualistic. Rather than presenting brutality as random spectacle, the sequence becomes the direct consequence of a single moral decision. Every horrifying moment traces back to the choice made outside the holding cell. By refusing to resolve the threat when they had the opportunity, the survivors unknowingly create the conditions for an even greater atrocity. The midpoint therefore accomplishes something unusually effective for a slasher film. It grants the heroes genuine victory, only to reveal that their greatest defeat begins at the exact moment they believe they have reclaimed control. In Glenesville Sanatorium, mercy is not rewarded, hesitation carries a terrible price, and the line between humanity and survival grows colder than the snow burying the world outside. By the time Wrong Turn 4 reaches its final act, the story has stripped away nearly every comforting illusion it introduced at the beginning. The lively group that laughed through the snow only hours earlier has been reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors carrying the psychological weight of relentless loss. Every failed escape, every ignored warning, and every moral compromise has narrowed their options until survival no longer feels like a realistic expectation. Instead, it becomes a desperate refusal to surrender. The abandoned halls of Glenesville Sanatorium no longer resemble the eerie refuge the characters first entered. They have transformed into a battlefield scarred by blood, shattered furniture, broken doors, and the lingering evidence of every horrific encounter that came before. Familiar corridors now carry memories of friends who never made it back, giving each step an emotional heaviness that extends beyond immediate danger. The building itself feels almost alive, as though decades of violence have permanently fused with its walls. Amid that devastation, Kenya and Sarah emerge as the final emotional anchors of the narrative. Neither has become an unstoppable action hero, nor does the film suddenly grant them impossible courage. Their determination grows from exhaustion rather than confidence. They understand the horrifying reality before them. Every attempt to reason with the situation has failed, every carefully considered plan has collapsed, and every hesitation has been exploited. What remains is a simple instinct shared by countless horror protagonists before them. Keep moving, keep fighting, and never willingly surrender to the darkness closing in. One of the film's strengths during this closing stretch is its refusal to romanticize survival. The remaining characters are physically drained, emotionally shattered, and increasingly overwhelmed by grief. Every decision carries visible desperation. Their fear is not hidden beneath heroic dialogue or triumphant speeches. Instead, it shapes every movement, reminding viewers that ordinary people pushed beyond their limits rarely become fearless. They simply continue because stopping would guarantee death. The brothers, meanwhile, remain relentless. Unlike many slasher villains who appear almost supernatural through silence alone, the Hillikers create terror through persistence. They never seem rushed because they understand that time favors them. Their victims are tired, injured, freezing, and unfamiliar with the terrain. Every passing minute increases those disadvantages. This patient style of pursuit makes the climax feel less like a traditional chase and more like an inevitable tightening of a trap that has been closing since the blizzard first forced everyone off course. Escaping the asylum finally becomes possible, but freedom arrives without relief. Stepping outside does not replace one danger with safety. It simply exchanges claustrophobic corridors for an endless frozen wilderness where visibility remains poor and shelter almost non-existent. The transition cleverly mirrors the film's opening structure. Earlier, the characters viewed the sanatorium as protection from the storm. Now the storm itself becomes the only barrier separating them from the killers still hunting behind them. The snow-covered landscape also restores a sense of scale that had temporarily disappeared inside the building. Vast white fields stretch endlessly in every direction, creating the unsettling impression that even open space can function as a prison. There are no crowded roads, no nearby towns, and no reassuring signs of civilization. Nature offers movement without genuine escape, reinforcing one of the film's central themes. Isolation is not defined by walls alone. Hope briefly returns through the snowmobiles. Machines that once symbolized youthful adventure now become essential tools for survival. The surviving characters understand that speed represents their only realistic advantage. If they can create enough distance before the brothers catch up, perhaps the nightmare can finally end. The sequence transforms familiar recreational vehicles into lifelines, giving the climax an energetic momentum that contrasts sharply with the slow, methodical horror dominating much of the film. The resulting pursuit injects fresh intensity into the narrative. Engines roar across frozen terrain while the surrounding wilderness blurs into streaks of white and gray. Unlike the confined terror inside Glensville, this confrontation embraces movement and urgency. Every turn through the snow carries uncertainty because visibility remains compromised, forcing both survivors and audience to wonder whether the next obstacle will be natural, mechanical, or human. The environment itself refuses to cooperate, ensuring that even apparent progress remains fragile. Visually, the chase creates a striking contrast between civilization and wilderness. The snowmobiles represent technology, planning, and modern control, while the brothers embody something primal, instinctive, and brutally adaptive. The conflict therefore extends beyond physical survival. It becomes a symbolic collision between ordered society and untamed violence, echoing the franchise's recurring fascination with humanity confronting forces that exist entirely outside conventional rules. Against overwhelming odds, dawn eventually begins to break across the frozen landscape. Light slowly replaces darkness, subtly altering the emotional atmosphere. Horror has long conditioned audiences to associate sunrise with survival. Night conceals monsters, while morning traditionally signals rescue, safety, and the restoration of normal life. Wrong Turn 4 deliberately plays with that expectation. As daylight spreads across the snow, both the characters and the audience experience a cautious sense of relief. They have endured unimaginable horrors, escaped the asylum, and seemingly outlasted the nightmare. This emotional release is essential because it lowers everyone's defenses at precisely the wrong moment. Rather than ending with an explosive confrontation against the killers, the film embraces one final act of devastating irony. The survivors do not fall because they stop fighting. They fall because they believe the struggle is finally over. Their attention shifts away from immediate danger toward the possibility of life beyond the nightmare, creating the exact vulnerability the brothers have exploited throughout the entire story. Then comes the final trap. Without warning, Three Fingers' razor wire snare delivers one of the bleakest endings in the franchise. The mechanism itself is horrifyingly simple, yet its execution feels brutally efficient. There is no extended chase, no dramatic final speech, and no miraculous last-second escape. The trap functions with cold precision, transforming a moment of hope into instant catastrophe. Its shocking decapitation effect is memorable not merely because of its graphic imagery but because of the emotional timing. Safety existed only long enough for everyone to believe in it. The conclusion leaves almost no room for conventional triumph. Every member of the group ultimately becomes another victim claimed by the wilderness surrounding Glensville. There is no victorious final girl standing beneath the sunrise, no comforting reassurance that good inevitably defeats evil, and no emotional release through justice. Instead, the film embraces complete annihilation, reinforcing the idea that entering this forgotten corner of the world was always a fatal mistake. That uncompromising ending explains much of the movie's lasting reputation among devoted horror fans. Wrong Turn 4 refuses to soften its conclusion for the sake of audience comfort. It commits fully to its bleak worldview, where nature remains indifferent, morality offers no guaranteed protection, and even surviving the longest does not necessarily mean surviving at all. As the frozen landscape returns to silence once more, Glensville Sanatorium and the wilderness surrounding it reclaim every secret they were never willing to surrender. Among the many characters who pass through the blood-soaked corridors of Glensville Sanatorium, Kenya occupies a particularly fascinating position because she never fits comfortably into the traditional mold of a slasher heroine. On the surface, she appears to embody many of the qualities audiences associate with a classic final girl. She is observant, resourceful, emotionally resilient, and willing to take responsibility when panic begins consuming everyone around her. Yet Wrong Turn 4 gradually reshapes those familiar expectations into something far more uncomfortable. Instead of celebrating the qualities that normally ensure survival, the film quietly asks whether those same virtues can become fatal weaknesses when confronted by absolute evil. From the beginning of the story, Kenya's motivations remain remarkably grounded. She is not driven by revenge, personal glory, or reckless curiosity. Her immediate objective is simple: keep her friends alive and find a way home. That focus makes her one of the most emotionally accessible characters in the film because her priorities never drift towards selfish survival. Even as the body count rises and fear overwhelms the group, she continues thinking collectively rather than individually. Every major decision she supports is rooted in protecting others instead of preserving herself. That instinct naturally pushes her into a leadership role. Interestingly, the film never formally appoints Kenya as the group's leader. Nobody pauses to vote or explicitly place authority in her hands. Leadership emerges through behavior rather than titles. While others argue, freeze, or react impulsively, she repeatedly attempts to evaluate situations before acting. She listens, mediates disagreements, and searches for practical solutions despite having no special knowledge or experience. In another horror film, those qualities might guarantee that she becomes the triumphant survivor standing beneath the final sunrise. Wrong Turn 4 has very different intentions. The film carefully separates competence from decisiveness, revealing that intelligence alone cannot overcome hesitation when confronting predators who recognize no moral boundaries. Kenya consistently demonstrates compassion, responsibility, and emotional control, yet those admirable qualities become increasingly difficult to reconcile with the brutal reality surrounding her. Every confrontation forces her to evaluate not only what is necessary but also what remains ethically acceptable. This conflict reaches its defining moment after the survivors successfully imprison the Hilliker brothers. At that point, the narrative presents an ethical dilemma rather than a tactical one. The killers are trapped. For the first time since entering the asylum, the balance of power favors the survivors. Kyle immediately recognizes the opportunity to eliminate the threat permanently, arguing that burning the brothers alive is the only decision capable of preventing further bloodshed. His proposal is horrifying, but it is horrifying because it requires ordinary people to become deliberate executioners. Kenya cannot accept that transformation. Her refusal is frequently criticized by audiences who evaluate the situation purely through the logic of survival. From a practical standpoint, destroying the brothers appears obvious. They have already demonstrated unimaginable cruelty, making any expectation of rehabilitation or peaceful resolution completely unrealistic. Yet judging Kenya's decision fairly requires understanding the psychological world she inhabits rather than the detached perspective available to viewers. Unlike the audience, she has not spent decades consuming slasher films where villains inevitably escape unless decisively eliminated. She enters the asylum carrying the moral framework of ordinary suburban life, a world built upon laws, accountability, and the belief that even terrible people should not be executed without necessity. Those values have shaped her entire identity long before the snowstorm begins. Expecting her to abandon them instantly under extreme pressure ignores how deeply moral conditioning influences human behavior. This is where the film subtly reinterprets the final girl archetype. Traditionally, the final girl succeeds because she adapts. She learns the killer's patterns, embraces survival instincts, and ultimately performs whatever action becomes necessary to defeat the threat. Her transformation represents personal growth through adversity. Kenya, however, follows a different trajectory. She adapts in countless practical ways, becoming more courageous, more alert, and more capable under pressure, yet she refuses to abandon the ethical principles defining who she is. Her humanity survives the ordeal even as her chances of physical survival steadily diminish. That distinction transforms her into a profoundly tragic protagonist. Rather than rewarding compassion, Wrong Turn 4 suggests that morality itself can become dangerously incompatible with environments governed entirely by predatory violence. The Hilliker brothers possess no comparable hesitation. They experience neither remorse nor ethical conflict. Every encounter therefore becomes fundamentally unequal because one side continues asking what is right while the other asks only what is effective. Psychologically, Kenya represents the collision between civilization and primal survival. Modern society conditions people to suppress violent impulses, resolve conflict through established systems, and preserve life whenever possible. Those values make communities functional and humane. Inside Glensville Sanatorium, however, every one of those assumptions collapses. There are no authorities to call, no institutions capable of restoring order, and no legal consequences preventing the brothers from continuing their slaughter. Civilization effectively disappears beneath the snow, leaving only instinct and immediate necessity. The tragedy lies in Kenya's inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to fully embrace that transformation. Importantly, the film never portrays her as weak. She demonstrates remarkable courage throughout the story, repeatedly risking herself to help others instead of seeking personal escape. She confronts danger directly, refuses to surrender emotionally, and continues searching for solutions long after hope becomes almost irrational. Her failure does not originate from cowardice. It emerges from the belief that retaining one's humanity remains worthwhile even when surrounded by inhuman brutality. Ironically, that very nobility becomes the mechanism of destruction. By insisting upon mercy during the moment when decisive violence could have ended the nightmare, she unintentionally guarantees additional suffering for everyone still alive. The brothers escape, regain control, and unleash horrors that would never have occurred had the survivors crossed the moral line she fought so hard to preserve. It is one of the cruelest forms of dramatic irony imaginable because her most admirable characteristic produces the story's most devastating consequence. This complexity explains why Kenya continues provoking discussion among horror fans years after the film's release. Some view her as frustratingly indecisive, arguing that common sense should have overridden ethical concerns. Others interpret her as one of the franchise's most realistic protagonists precisely because she behaves like an ordinary person rather than an action hero. Faced with the unimaginable, she clings desperately to the values that have always defined her, even when those values cease functioning within the nightmare she has entered. By the film's conclusion, Kenya's journey feels less like the rise of a victorious heroine and more like the collapse of a fundamentally decent person trapped inside a world that no longer recognizes decency as a survival strategy. She begins as a capable leader determined to protect her friends and ends as a tragic figure whose greatest strength, her unwavering belief in humanity, ultimately becomes the very reason humanity loses. The Hilliker brothers occupy a unique place within slasher cinema because they are never presented as sophisticated masterminds or charismatic manipulators. They rarely speak, they have no elaborate speeches explaining their worldview, and they are not driven by the kind of calculated revenge that defines many iconic horror villains. Instead, Wrong Turn 4 portrays them as something far more unsettling. They resemble forces of nature, violent, instinctive, and terrifyingly consistent. Like a blizzard or a wildfire, they do not negotiate, compromise, or hesitate. Once their hunt begins, destruction simply follows. At first glance, it is easy to reduce Three-Finger, Saw-Tooth, and One-Eye to grotesque monsters whose only purpose is generating spectacular death scenes. The film certainly encourages that reaction through their disturbing appearances and relentless brutality. Yet beneath the graphic makeup lies a surprisingly coherent psychological design. Each brother contributes a different dimension to the collective threat, making them feel less like interchangeable killers and more like a warped family unit whose members fulfill complementary roles. Three-Finger naturally commands the greatest attention. Longtime fans already recognize him as the franchise's most enduring figure, and Wrong Turn 4 reinforces that status through his confidence and tactical awareness. He rarely appears reckless. Instead, he studies his surroundings, anticipates human reactions, and patiently manipulates situations until escape becomes nearly impossible. His weaponry reflects that personality. Rather than relying solely on overwhelming force, he favors tools and traps that transform ordinary environments into lethal spaces. Every corridor, doorway, or snowy trail can become part of his strategy because he understands the terrain better than anyone pursuing it. Sawtooth introduces a different energy. His movements often feel more erratic, reflecting an unpredictability that keeps both characters and audience uncertain about how he will respond. Where Three Finger demonstrates measured patience, Sawtooth embodies explosive aggression. His physical appearance reinforces this instability, making every encounter feel dangerously volatile. The uncertainty surrounding his behavior becomes frightening in itself because victims cannot anticipate whether he will strike immediately or prolong their suffering for his own amusement. One Eye completes the trio by emphasizing relentless physical intimidation. His imposing presence contributes to the impression that escape through direct confrontation is almost impossible. Even without extensive dialogue, his body language communicates persistence and raw predatory instinct. Together, the brothers create an effective balance of calculated planning, chaotic violence, and overwhelming force. Individually, they are dangerous. Collectively, they become something much harder to overcome. Their hunting style further separates them from more conventional slasher villains. They do not simply chase victims from one location to another. They stalk, observe, and manipulate. The abandoned asylum becomes an extension of their own instincts, allowing them to exploit blind corners, hidden passages, and environmental hazards with terrifying efficiency. They rarely waste movement because every action reflects years of familiarity with the building they now occupy. To outsiders, Glensville appears confusing and abandoned. To the brothers, it functions almost like an extension of their own bodies. The choice of weapons also reinforces this relationship with their environment. Improvised tools, rusted equipment, sharpened objects, and brutal traps emerge naturally from the decaying institution rather than feeling artificially introduced for dramatic effect. Violence therefore appears rooted within the location itself. The asylum supplies the instruments, while the brothers provide the intent. Together they transform forgotten medical spaces into grotesque hunting grounds. Motivation is another area where Wrong Turn 4 quietly resists unnecessary complexity. The brothers do not pursue wealth, ideology, or revenge in any conventional sense. Survival remains their most basic driving force. Cannibalism, horrifying as it is, functions not merely as shock value but as the logical continuation of lives spent entirely outside civilized society. Food, territory, and self-preservation become inseparable. Their violence therefore operates according to instincts rather than philosophical beliefs. Yet reducing everything to survival alone would ignore another disturbing characteristic running throughout the film. The brothers appear to enjoy what they do. Their cruelty frequently carries an unsettling sense of playfulness. Victims are not always dispatched as efficiently as possible. Instead, suffering is prolonged through elaborate traps, psychological intimidation, and moments of almost childlike amusement. This behavior suggests that violence has evolved beyond necessity into ritual. Killing is no longer simply about eliminating threats or obtaining food. It has become entertainment, routine, and perhaps the only form of expression remaining within lives stripped of conventional humanity. Despite this brutality, one emotional bond consistently remains intact: family. Among themselves, the brothers display remarkable loyalty. They cooperate instinctively, rescue one another when opportunities arise, and respond aggressively whenever one member is threatened. This connection creates an ironic contrast with the college students. While the human protagonists gradually fracture under fear, arguments, and conflicting priorities, the so-called monsters remain united by unwavering mutual commitment. Their methods are horrifying, but their loyalty is absolute. Perhaps the film's most fascinating irony lies in how the brothers perceive Glensville Sanatorium itself.